record on, are actually threatened. So talking about critical habitat to start is useful. And so essentially what that is if species start to get recognized as needing to be listed as threatened or endangered, then, you know, Fish and Wildlife Service can get involved and say, do we need to designate any habitat as critical habitat? And really what that says is they look at it and they say, at the time when those animals start to get listed, is there anything that we need to take into account in terms of habitat? So at the time they're listed, within their current geographic range, what is present, what's available, and what needs to be considered for also designating as critical habitat. And so really the things that they take into account, into consideration is there particular areas that need to be designated to ensure the survival of that species? And then furthermore, within that category, specific things they look at is what needs to be protected to maintain suitable breeding habitat to allow growth of the population, because right, ideally we wouldn't just save these species that are getting listed, but also protect enough habitat that there's potential for more growth in the future to allow them to rebound. So not only breeding habitat, but just enough habitat in general to allow population growth and normal functioning. Is there resources that are going to support the physiology of those animals within that habitat? So is there enough available food, water, nutrients? So, you know, habitat could also be for plants, so nutrients is really important for plants, not just always animals. Is there enough cover for animals? That's another category they look at. So there's lots of different things that they want to make sure they're taking into account when deciding if habitat actually needs to be designated as a critical. And then really what that means is if they're going to designate critical habitat, then that says, you know, in the future, anything that's proposed on that land in terms of anything that could alter that habitat and might have an impact on the species needs to actually be evaluated. It can't just happen freely in the future. It has to be discussed. It has to go through a process, and really it needs to be evaluated to decide if that proposed change of land or anything that's going to happen on that land is safe to the animal moving forward. So that's what's important about critical habitat. And I just want to provide a little bit of background information before we start to dive into some examples. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. So you might see a little less of me, but I want to show you some of the animals and that I'm going to use as examples. So Patty, let me know if you can see it all right. Is it this one? Maybe?
Yes.
No, that's not the one I want though.
Oh.
Give me 1 second. I don't know. Can you see the PowerPoint titled Limiting Resources now, Patty, or no?
No.
No? All right, hold on. Okay, this should do it. Now we're good. Now you can see limiting resources, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So the first one I want to start to go over is I talked about we're going to do kind of terrestrial and then aquatic. So this is a video that I took myself over at Flint River Aquarium. This is a marbled salamander. And while the marbled salamander is doing fine, that species is not threatened or endangered. They actually have a pretty good geographic range and distribution right now, spanning across most of the Southeast. But the reason I took a video of this animal to show you is because this is a mole salamander, and I'm going to talk about two other mole salamanders that are not doing as great as the marbled salamander. So this is the only animal that we have right now between our locations that is a mole salamander. But I wanted to talk about this to kind of make a link to the other two mole salamanders that we actually are going to talk about. So what you can see even right now, just behavior-wise, is something that's common for all of these mole salamanders is when they're not in their aquatic breeding habitat, Once they move on land, a lot of them spend a lot of time underground. They might find burrows, they might go underneath stumps, logs. They try to get underground as much as they can. And that's just safe for them. It provides cover, right? So that's one of the categories we talked about with critical habitat. And it provides some refuge in terms of even physiological conditions. So it's going to be moist. It has temperature control. And so that's a marbled salamander. Again, that one's fine. But the first one that I really want to talk about is this. So does anybody know what that species is? Anybody? No? So this is a flatwood salamander. And it's actually broken into 2 species, but I'm going to talk about flatwood salamanders in general. And to provide some context, they have lost, I think, 82% of the habitat that they actually used to have in the past. So they're down to about 18% of the habitat available that they've had historically. So they're really struggling. They are found in Georgia, so they only have isolated populations left. And I think there's only really 3 primary locations left where they're found and known to still be surviving. And so they are listed now. They are listed. And so there's a lot of funding available for these animals right now. They are starting to get worked on a lot. And so what they primarily use for habitat is longleaf pine habitat with wiregrass understory. And that kind of open canopy habitat is really important for them. So we know that that's habitat that needs to be protected for this species now. And one of the biggest reasons that they're losing so much habitat is because fire is being suppressed. So I'm not sure how much you all know about fire suppression, and just historically there was fires much more often, but now, obviously fires aren't super ideal for people. And so we have been preventing them a little bit more often, and we haven't been allowing habitat to burn as frequently as it needs to maintain this habitat that's really important for these animals. And so what we're finding is that fires aren't occurring as often. It's getting a lot more dense, so a lot more vegetation is growing in the understory. That's preventing that really important wiregrass herbaceous veg that's typically found on the understory level, essentially on the ground level, to get covered up. So with a bunch of shading, with a really dense mid-canopy level, we're losing that herbaceous vegetation level. That's really important for these animals. And it's really important for a couple of reasons. So first, again, going back to those criteria that I talked about, that wiregrass habitat on the ground provides lots of habitat for herbaceous insects, so insects that are going to be eating all that vegetation. And so when we lose that wiregrass habitat, we're going to lose a lot of the food availability that's necessary for the flatwood salamander. Another thing is that it provides moisture. So that wiregrass is good at retaining moisture in a layer that the eggs, that the adults that you're seeing there with a really pretty pattern lay their eggs in. And so that's getting covered up too. So if there is really dense vegetation, it gets buried in leaf litter and they lose that important egg-laying habitat that's associated with the wiregrass as well. And you can see the larva up in the top right-hand corner too, above the really pretty flatwood salamander. So that's what the larval stage looks like. That's in the wetland. And so what they'll do is they'll travel to these open canopy habitats and they'll lay their eggs in temporary wetlands, which is also very important. So they do not like to have fish present in their wetland breeding habitat because they will eat pretty much all of the eggs and larvae before they even have a chance to get out of these breeding locations. But really the big thing that's threatening these salamanders right now is fire suppression and the conversion of their open canopy habitat that they rely on and specialize in to more dense habitat coverage. So that open canopy resource is what we're considering limiting here, and that's why I've decided to bring it into this discussion. Does anybody have any questions about them before I move on? Okay. So here's an example right here at Cheehaw that I took a video of. So what you're looking at is an area that was burned. Right now, that video that you're seeing is a burned habitat area. So you can see how open the mid canopy layers are, right? You really just have that crown canopy where the trees are nice and tall, but in the mid and even the ground layer, It's relatively open. It's only herbaceous veg on the ground. There's plenty of sunlight reaching it still. And so that's more in line with what these frosted flatwood salamanders would prefer for habitat. And then in a second, you'll see an area that's no longer being burned. And that's sort of what is threatening these species now, is having this conversion to this really dense, unburned area. So as you can imagine, as we start to lose our fires, our natural fires, this is going to happen to a lot of areas, and it's just completely different habitat, and it's not going to support species that specialize in that those fire burned habitats. So I thought that was cool, just to give you an idea of an actual burned versus unburned location and the difference it can have for habitat quality and characteristics. Okay, so the second species that I want to talk about, which is one of my favorites, is called the Sonoran tiger salamander. So this is also a mole salamander. You can see the similarities and characteristics between the two species. They're both terrestrial animals. And so also kind of similar, which is weird, is that they also inhabit relatively open landscapes. And they are found, so there's also subspecies of the Sonoran tiger salamander. There's also kind of a cool link between the flatwoods and the tiger salamanders. There's several subspecies. So this is the Sonoran tiger salamander subspecies specifically, that's found in San Rafael Valley in Arizona. And they are almost exclusively restricted to that region. And the reason that they're endangered right now and of special concern is because the wetlands they used for breeding historically have actually dried up because they were spring fed, and now they are no longer spring fed, and they lost their historic breeding grounds. And so you can see this is the valley they're found in between the mountains. Does anybody know why I put a picture of a cow up there? Why is that cow really important to the Sonoran tiger salamander? What do you think the link is between those cows and the survival of this species in that constrained valley? Does anybody have any ideas?
Any ideas?
Come on, someone take a stab at it.
Does it have to do with something like
It has to do with something they eat.
Well, something they eat?
meat? They eat meat.
Patty, do they have anything?
Y'all have any?
Okay, the cows are herbivores, but what does that have to do with the survival of the salamanders?
I don't.
It's not quite that's not quite where I was going with it. There's something else that's important to the cows that's also important to the salamanders. All right, so the connection is that ranchers in the valley also needed those spring-fed wetlands so that their cows had a source of water during the really hot summers. And when those spring-fed wetlands dried up, the ranchers had to be able to support their business still, right? They still wanted their cows to be able to use all of this ranch land. And so they built man-made cattle tanks, or wetlands essentially, that were made specifically for the reason of allowing cows to still have a water source to survive with and drink. And the Sonoran tiger salamanders actually were able to locate these wetlands and start using them as their breeding habitat. And the species survived by adapting to use these man-made wetlands now as their breeding habitat. And so the pretty salamander that you see in the top left-hand corner with a really cool yellow and black design, that's the adult terrestrial phase. But what you see on the bottom is the aquatic stage. So that's what they look like when they're in the water, when they're in the breeding habitat. And actually that bottom picture is of what we call a pedomorph, which is an adult salamander. So it actually is an adult, and you can see, it's hard to tell scale, but the bottom salamander is actually a bit larger than that terrestrial salamander, but they're both large salamanders compared to larvae that you would find in wetlands, which are much smaller. And so a pedomorph is an adult salamander that maintains the characteristics of a larva. So you can still see the gills coming off the back of the head, those really feathery gills. They still have a tail fin. You can see at the end of the tail, it's really keeled, that they would use for swimming in their aquatic environment. And that's because the terrestrial environment can be hot and it can be stressful. And so these salamanders are super impressive in that they can make the decision to maintain their larval characteristics as adults and stay in that aquatic habitat if they think that's going to be more suitable for them. And they won't leave until they really feel it necessary to go out into the terrestrial habitat. And then they can actually make the decision to morph into that terrestrial phase that you see in the top. And that all depends on conditions. So, you know, if oxygen levels become too low in the wetland, they will phase into the terrestrial morph. If the wetland's just going to dry up for some reason, if the ranchers aren't keeping up with that aquatic habitat, then they will phase out and they will become terrestrial and they'll start selecting habitat on land. But really, these salamanders are listed as endangered because they are confined to this valley, and now they're sort of at the mercy of these cattle tanks that are maintained by ranchers. And so, you know, researchers have gotten involved. They've formed really good relationships with the ranchers. So it's really important to maintain that close connection with them. And that's kind of where human dimensions comes into play, which I think is really cool, is having to have a relationship with those ranchers, because they could just say, you know, we don't want you on our land. But maintaining a good relationship is a way for us to continue to study these really endangered populations of Sonoran tiger salamanders that are confined to just this one region. I believe they also extend south into Mexico a little bit, but even with that, those populations, the majority of these animals are still confined to this area and in trouble. So another example of species that are confined by limited habitat now, and oftentimes that's something that can lead to isolated populations being a really big concern for species and maintaining critical habitat. So essentially, if something was to wipe through that valley, all of those animals are going to be threatened because it is an isolated location and they don't really have any buffer populations elsewhere. So does anybody have any questions about those?
Question?
So do you all understand? Do you all understand how those cattle tanks now, those man-made water tanks, are essential critical habitat now for that endangered species? Because they rely on that, we have to consider those cattle tanks now as important habitat. Because without those, these animals cannot breed, and those populations are just going to crash. They have to have that habitat to maintain breeding populations, which is, again, one of those criteria that we talked about at the beginning.
How big is the salamander big? That one on the bottom was huge.
Yeah, they can be over a foot. So the pedomorph on the bottom, I think, was a little over a foot in length. So they are really big. But again, that bottom one is what we call pedomorph. So it's just an aquatic phase of an adult. So when the larvae are actually in their egg, just coming out of their egg masses and just hatching, their larva can be as small as an inch or so, if not even. So really cool animals there. I mean, not all salamanders can have that pedomorph stage where they can maintain those larval characteristics as an adult. But yeah, they get pretty large. And the adults are also anywhere from 10 to 11 inches in length as well. So they're tiger salamanders are definitely on the bigger end of the scale for size.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No, I got it.
All right, should we move on to our aquatic example?
It might get a little bit.
Patty, are we okay to move on, or did someone else have a question on that slide? All right, I'm gonna move on to the aquatic. that okay? Okay, cool. All right, so our last example, and I'm just gonna run this in the background. This is some footage I captured. I don't know how many of you have been to Flint River Aquarium. So this is at our Blue Hole exhibit. And this is some footage that I just captured, which shows off some pretty cool species. So that you're looking at right there is the Gulf sturgeon. That species is threatened, and we'll talk a little bit about the system and the limiting factors there as well. And then there's striped bass that you can see going by as well. And we'll talk a little bit about them and why they're related as well and why I'm playing that footage. So a little bit of current topics we'll throw in while we're talking about limiting factors. Is anybody aware that there's been a Supreme Court case that happened just on Monday, I believe, related to the Flint River, Chattahoochee, and the Apalachicola River Basin? Is anybody aware that that Supreme Court case was happening or what it's about? So Florida has essentially taken it to the Supreme Court now, and Alabama, but Florida is the one that was making the current case that Georgia is pulling too much water out of the Chattahoochee upstream and not leaving enough water flowing downriver to Florida and Alabama. And so this has actually been an ongoing, what they're calling the tri-state water war, but this has been an ongoing topic since the early 90s, about the concern for how much water Georgia is pulling out before it can get downstream to these other two states. And so initially it started out as concern because Atlanta, as a really big growing area, started pulling too much water out to support Atlanta and their economic growth, and just their growing population size in general. And when a dam was originally put in far upstream, it wasn't even built in consideration for it to be pulling water for Atlanta. It was just supposed to be for power. But now they are pulling water into Atlanta. And so there's been this ongoing conflict between the three states, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, about how much water is going to get allocated to each state. And they're all in agreement that, water is an important resource for maintaining economic status. And they're all in agreement about that. They're just not in agreement about their concern that Georgia is now pulling too much water before it can even reach these southern states. And so, Alabama is concerned about, just getting water in general. They're concerned about biodiversity loss if these rivers are having too much water pulled for them. Florida is really concerned that they have this really big oyster economic, it's called Apalachicola Bay. And they're worried that now that's no longer functioning because they claim it's because too much water is being pulled before it can get to them. And so that's one of the reasons it's gone to the Supreme Court now, is because Florida's really starting to go after Georgia. And so I don't know that there's been a resolution reached yet. Yeah, do you have a question?
So if they came to a decision, how would they change the word from?
Patty, can you repeat that for me, Patty?
How would they change the water flow from one place to another if they came to that decision? That if they, can you hear me?
Yeah, is she asking how they're monitoring water flow?
No, how would they change, how would they change it? Because Georgia's, they're being real dicks about the whole thing. And so how would Georgia not be that way?
So actually, they have moved away now from the concern being about how much water is getting pulled for Atlanta. They're actually not even debating that anymore. The amount of water that's being pulled for Atlanta is now, I think, not even contentious because they've gotten that to better rates. The big concern now is how much is getting pulled for agriculture. And so, Georgia's whole argument is our economy would go downhill. A lot of people would lose their jobs if we couldn't maintain how much water we're pulling for agriculture. And they're even starting to, make arguments that after Hurricane Michael rolled through, that they had to get a bunch of new systems that are actually more capable of, not overusing water consumption. And so I think Georgia's claim is that they can't reduce it. Like they need as much as they are pulling. And I think that's the argument and the stance that they're taking. So to answer your question, I don't know how they would reduce that. But does anybody have any other thoughts? I was curious as to what your guys' ideas were on this whole dilemma. And I was curious to see if you guys have any opinions. Any thoughts? If not, I can go into some more of the technicalities about how we're impacting these river watersheds. Okay, so I'll talk about that a little bit. So we know obviously pulling water itself is a big concern. So we don't want to consume too much water that there's not enough to properly function and support the natural flow regimes of these watersheds to support the animals that are there. So one of the big concerns right off the bat, obviously, is maintaining appropriate conditions for the wildlife and the biodiversity that's in this watershed. But then that's not the only thing that's threatening these watersheds right now. Does anybody know what one of the other biggest threats to river systems in general these days is?
Threats to river systems in general.
Any ideas? You guys heard of?
We all have ideas. They're saying sewage, pollution.
Perfect. Yep, absolutely. What about sedimentation? Have you guys heard of sedimentation? No. So one of the biggest concerns is that as development is starting to pile up along river borders, as vegetation is removed, there's nothing preventing erosion from happening, and all of the soil and sand and silt, even especially from development, so from washing into watersheds. And so there's many problems involved with sedimentation. The first is that it can bury a lot of habitat. So a lot of animals, including the Gulf sturgeon that I've been showing you, so that's why I have them up, is they are an anadromous fish. So that means while they do spend time out in the coast in saltwater, they move upriver and upstream to lay their eggs in freshwater habitat. And what they do is they lay their eggs on the bottom. They have these sticky eggs that can adhere to the bottom, and so they don't wash away. But if there's a whole lot of sediment washing into our rivers and our streams, then that habitat is going to be buried, and they're not going to have anywhere to lay their eggs. And then this is perfect that he's swimming by right now. If you look, he has those barbels on the front of his, on the bottom of his face, and you can see his mouth is on the bottom. So Gulf sturgeon actually feed on the bottom on macroinvertebrates. And so another big problem with sedimentation is that a lot of macroinvertebrates, as you can imagine, hide on the floor or the bed of rivers. And if there's a lot of sediment covering the bottom, that's going to block a lot of habitat availability for the food that these Gulf sturgeon rely on. Now, they primarily do feed out in the Gulf anyway, but as you can imagine, the young stay in freshwater for a couple of years before they can really make that journey out into the Gulf. So it's preventing egg-laying habitat, so breeding habitat. Again, coming back to some of those criteria we were talking about earlier, that's important for maintaining populations. It's burying food availability. If sediment gets too stacked up over time, then they will come in and dredge riverbeds, which means they essentially pull out all of the sediment that's built up over time. And that's because essentially we are concerned about the fact that our boats wouldn't be able to move through our areas. And so, you know, obviously coming back to the economy again, we want to make sure we can have all of our goods getting transferred by barges. But then dredging is going to rip up all the bottom, and obviously that's not ideal for the habitat conditions of these animals. What's another big one that you think? So knowing that Gulf sturgeon and then striped bass also travel into freshwater habitat for their breeding, what do you think is something else that's really impactful on them being able to complete those life history requirements of moving into freshwater? Does anybody have any ideas?
What'd you say? Fishermen is what they're saying?
Okay, that could be potential. Yep. I mean, overfishing is a big problem in general for a lot of fish, But in terms of movement to get to breeding habitat, what would be preventing that?
How many of water? Somebody's saying water temperature. Well, how many of y'all go out on boats? Waters, I mean, are they just super clear?
No.
If you were a fish, what do you complain about when you're on your boats? Think some of the fish complain about the same thing?
The sound. Yeah, how they can see into the water. And like,
Well,
those turning up the, sort of like it is just riding through there. The sandbars, probably, the only time they sleep.
Y'all must go out on Lake Blackshear with your boat. You don't go in my backyard.
I go to your boat. I go what? I go like.
Okay, well, I think,
Right. So I hear lots of discussion on water properties again, which is good. So again, that comes back to like if we're even pulling too much water out and how dirty it is, which could be a factor of the sedimentation. But one of the other really big threats, which I was talking about, which is a concern, was the dams that are put in. So if these sturgeon have to travel upriver to get to their freshwater habitat breeding locations, dams can literally block them now from returning to their breeding grounds. And what's really interesting is that these animals will try to return to do their own breeding from where they were spawned. And so putting these dams up, it decreases the amount of available breeding habitat. So now we've also constricted where they can even breed. And so on top of the other threats, reducing breeding habitat is a big concern for these animals. So that's kind of a limiting factor in terms of habitat is breeding habitat. Enough water availability in general with how much is being pulled out for economic purposes. But yeah, that's what I kind of had for you today. So I can open it up to any questions you guys have now. I'm happy to answer any that you have. Let me see, I can.
questions? I had one about the invasive species that block waterways like alligator grass and coontail and stuff like that. In terms of, you know, we haven't talked about the depleting the oxygen levels and stuff yet, but do they also cause blockage that is significant?
In these watersheds?
Yeah.
So I don't know how much oxygen depletion would be a concern in major watersheds like this. I know oxygen depletion is definitely a concern in lentic systems, water systems, which is non-flowing water. That's when oxygen depletion can really become a problem. Actually, not to bring it back to amphibians, but a big concern for amphibians is with some wetland habitat decreasing, more animals are going to have to pack into the same wetlands to do their breeding. And it can get to the point where there'll be too many animals in one wetland and they will deplete all the oxygen. And we've even had wetlands that I've worked in the past that even though they don't lose the water, you will just see mass die off because the animals couldn't get out fast enough. They couldn't metamorph fast enough to get out of the water before they became anoxic. So I don't know specifically about competition for resources such as oxygen availability in major watersheds is, but I know it's a concern in some habitat types.
Questions? We want to ask good questions. Y'all, keep it on. Make it bread. Keep it on.
I'm limiting my question answering to relevant questions.
Like limiting resources.
So I know that talk focused a lot on habitat itself as the limiting resource, but Feel free to open it up. You don't have any questions about either of those salamander species?
Nita she was getting ready to ask a question.
If like Florida and Alabama were in that private water, like how would they change the water flow?
Well, that's what,
So like would there be a specific thing like the river or something that would change the water flow?
So right now, what's changing the water flow is how much is being pulled out. So I think the only change that could be made if it came down to that would be putting regulations on how much water can be taken out of those systems for agriculture.
Okay.
so there would be like legal limitations.
So it would have to come down to essentially law. If it came down to that, if the Supreme Court is going to step in and help solve this case eventually, the way that they're going to alter water flow is if they're going to start putting regulations on how much water each state can take for whatever they're using it for. So again, right now, it's not even the concern isn't even in Atlanta. It's in how much they're pulling out of wells for their agriculture right now. So whether or not Florida is successful in getting the Supreme Court to back them and start putting regulations on how much water southern Georgia can pull for their agriculture, that's what's going to determine if water flow is altered.
Think about what, can you talk about the longleaf pine ecosystem a little bit, and burning? Think about the project you did. I'll have questions about. What are some, maybe you can tell him some species you learned about it.
Red cockaded woodpecker.
Red cockaded woodpecker, Boca tortoise. The alligators. So is there?
Does he know about our project that we did, or tree, tree?
He does not know about your phylogenetic tree that you did. So.
Do you all know how they would manage for the flatwood salamanders, considering they need habitat that's opened up, that's more open canopy? Do you know how they would manage for that species?
So open up the canopy. How would they? What is it that they need that we need in this habitat?
Did you all know that they actually do prescribed burns? So since it's not happening naturally as often, they will go in and they have burn teams and they will go in and prescribe burns in a controlled way that will knock down all that mid canopy density and open that habitat back up for these species. So a big thing that they're doing is burns. And then another big thing they're doing, which is when populations really start to become of concern, is they actually start collecting eggs and they rear some animals and they do some captive breeding in hopes that they can raise animals past the stage that they might not naturally make it past on their own, and then release them in the wild to buffer populations.
Are birds is there any species that birds are hurting per se, but not benefiting?
Well, the nice thing about birds is that they can avoid that, right? So they can take off for a little while. I'm sure some bird species are going to become more adapted and can thrive in dense habitat more than others, rather than that open longleaf pine habitat. But really the idea is that they want to bring back the natural habitat conditions and the species that were present when those conditions were there. So their concern is managing for that habitat type and animals that were historically associated with that habitat. And the nice thing about the flatwood salamanders is that they're mole salamanders, so they go underground. So they are also naturally adapted to be able to avoid those fires and those burns. They can go right underground and survive those fires as well.
Where might they go underground?
Oh, the burrows that the tourists dig.
Okay, so possibly another.
We talked about that.
So
did your biology teacher teach you that?
So you're right on. They do use the burrow of another animal, but it's not tortoises. Do you know what they use the burrows of? Remember, this is wetland habitat to a certain degree as well.
Wetland. Oh, okay.
They can use crayfish burrows actually. So have you ever seen a crayfish burrow? How they dig up all the dirt and they toss it out? They can go right into crayfish burrows. But it's also not uncommon for them to just hide under a log as well, because the logs aren't going to burn through all the way when they're doing those burns. If it's a big enough log, or even if they can get underneath the root system of a tree, any way that they can get underground, they're gonna. That's what they do. They're mole salamanders. They get underground and they can maintain themselves.
Yeah, well, we can talk about this. I love how they. I was trying to keep it wild for a while.
Do we have any other questions?
How long have you been working with Chihuahua? How long have you been with Chihuahua?
I think I'm 4 days out from 3 months.
Okay.
So relatively new.
My one friend really wants to know if you're a Chihuahua right. If you're a Chihuahua right now.
If I'm a Chihuahua what?
Right now.
Oh yes, yes, yep.
What animals have behind you the antlers?
What animals what?
Is that what animal is that behind you? The antlers behind you. There are antlers behind you.
Patty, I can't quite understand them. Can you help me out?
The antlers behind you.
Oh, that's gotta be elk.
Okay.
I think that's elk.
Elk. Are you in your office? Or are you in
Yes.
their room?
Do we have any other questions related to limiting factors?
Oh. No, he did not kill this elk.
No.
They know, y'all know a little bit about two species.
Wait,
Yeah, y'all know a lot about, we've been doing, our phenomenon's been the differences between reindeer and our longleaf pine ecosystem here and the caribou, the reindeer up in the biome, the tundra biome.
Sure.
So we've been comparing genetics and, doing ecology using that phenomenon. So,
Very cool.
yeah.
I saw a bunch of the caribou up in the tundra habitat.
Cool.
Yeah.
I was up in Scotland and I got to go hike up to a herd of reindeer, and so I was just so that went on.
Very cool.
Or antlers maybe.
Sure.
Yeah, I got to feed them and pick fur and sit with them and.
Cool.
My mom told me that I need to go to
Hey, I think we should all pitch in a GoFundMe and get a school bus, and we'll decorate it, and then we'll go trips.
Okay, so let's see if we have any more relevant questions so that. Okay. Right, y'all. He really probably has other, commitments and everything.
Yeah. If you guys don't have any other more questions, I think I'm gonna.
I have a really quick one. Nothing to do with anything, but is there could any of the Chihuahua people come to school and bring animals for us to hold and pet and
Oh, yeah, we talked about that. How we talked about last night, y'all come in bringing some stuff to us.
That is not a question I know how to answer.
Yeah.
I don't know in terms of what in-person programming looks like right now.
Yeah, we kind of possibly, maybe. I think that they have exhausted all of their brain resources.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see you guys again in the future, though. So
Oh, for
Okay.
sure.
come up with some questions.
All right.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. Good seeing all of you.
Bye, Tom.
Bye.
Thank you.